Hey, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive. We're all super busy these days, and sometimes things come up and, well, we need to reschedule things.
Yeah, happens to the best of us.
And, sometimes it's a little awkward, especially if you're still working on your English skills.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
we thought it'd be really helpful to do a deep dive on this. And luckily, we've got a fantastic English learning podcast that covers this topic perfectly.
I'm excited to jump in.
So are you ready to, become, masters of rescheduling?
I think so. Let's see what we can learn.
All right, so the podcast starts off by talking about some key vocabulary. They focus on three words: reschedule, inconvenience, and postpone.
Okay, so I'm guessing there are subtle differences between these, right? They all seem pretty similar on the surface.
Yeah, at first glance, they all basically mean the same thing, but I have a feeling there are some important nuances.
Yeah, for sure. I think the biggest thing is the level of formality and consideration.
Okay, I like that. So how would you break down, the differences between those three words?
Well, reschedule. That's kind of the most neutral one. It's just about moving the appointment to a new time.
Yeah.
But inconvenience now, that acknowledges that you're causing a bit of trouble for the other person.
Yeah, you're disrupting their day.
Exactly. It adds that extra layer of consideration, which can be really important.
It's like you're saying, hey, I know this is messing things up a bit, and I'm sorry for that.
Exactly. And then you've got postpone, which is more about delaying something without necessarily setting a new time right away.
Oh, okay. So, if you're not sure when you'll be free.
Yeah, exactly. It gives you a little breathing room to sort things out.
So that's like if something really unexpected comes up.
Exactly.
Okay, so just by choosing the right word, you can really set a different tone for the whole conversation.
Absolutely. And the podcast actually gives some great examples of how this plays out in real conversations.
Oh, perfect. Like what kind of examples?
Well, for instance, you could say, I may need to reschedule, and that gets the point across. But if you add something like, I hope this doesn't inconvenience you too much, that shows you're really thinking about the other person.
It's like you're going the extra mile to be polite.
Exactly. It can make a huge difference in maintaining a good relationship, especially in a professional setting.
Okay, so being mindful of these little differences can really make you a more effective communicator.
Definitely. And it's not just about the words themselves, it's also about the phrases you use.
Oh, right, right. The podcast talks about some of those classic phrases like, what's up, can't make it, and of course, something came up.
Yeah, those are the go-tos.
But I gotta admit, sometimes something came up feels a little vague, you know? Is that always the best approach?
Well, it really depends on the situation and who you're talking to.
Okay, so context matters.
Absolutely. In casual settings, it's usually fine.
Yeah.
But if it's a more formal situation, like with a client or a boss, you might want to be a bit more specific.
Right, especially if it's a recurring meeting or something.
Yeah, you don't want to give the impression that you're always flaking out.
So it's all about finding that balance between being polite and being clear.
Exactly. You want to be respectful of the other person's time, but you also need to be honest about why you need to reschedule.
Okay, so we've talked about some key vocabulary and those handy little phrases for getting out of an appointment. But how do we actually put all this together into a smooth rescheduling strategy? What are some other things we should keep in mind?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, and luckily the podcast dives into that as well.
Okay, perfect. Because I have to admit, I'm a little curious about the best way to actually have that rescheduling conversation,
Yeah, me too. It can definitely be a little tricky sometimes.
especially if you're trying to find a new time that works for everyone.
Absolutely. So I think that's a great place to pick up in our next segment.
All right, sounds good. I'm ready to become a rescheduling ninja.
Let's do it.
All right, so where were we? Oh, yeah, we were talking about how to put all this rescheduling know-how into practice.
Right, like how to actually have those conversations smoothly. And you know what? The podcast actually has this funny anecdote about one of the hosts.
Oh, yeah, tell me about that.
So apparently he had this important business meeting, but it happened to be on the same day as a huge World Cup match.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and his team was playing, so you can imagine the dilemma.
I've been there for sure. Work versus something you're really passionate about. It's tough.
Totally. And guess what he did? He actually used the something came up excuse to get out of the meeting and watch the game.
Oh, he did. I can't believe he got away with that.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. But, it actually brings up a really important point that the podcast hosts emphasize. It's not always about having the perfect excuse. Sometimes it's better to reschedule than to try and force a meeting when you're distracted.
That's so true. I mean, we've
Right.
all been in those meetings where we're just not mentally present.
Exactly. And it's not really fair to yourself or the other people involved.
Yeah, you're not doing your best work, and you're probably not absorbing the information either.
Right. So sometimes rescheduling is actually the most respectful thing you can do.
Okay, so it's not about finding a loophole. It's about being honest with yourself and the other person.
Exactly. And recognizing when you're not able to give your full attention.
Okay, I love that.
Yeah.
But how do you actually navigate that conversation? I mean, I can't imagine saying I'd rather watch soccer would go over well in most professional settings.
Haha. Yeah. Probably not the best approach, but the key is to be upfront and proactive. The podcast really stresses the importance of giving as much notice as
Oh,
possible.
yeah, that's huge.
Yeah.
No one wants to be scrambling at the last minute because of sudden cancellation.
Exactly. Even a quick heads up can make a big difference.
So give notice. Check it. What about apologizing for the inconvenience? Is that always necessary?
I'd say it's always a good idea, especially if you're the one initiating the change.
Okay, makes sense.
It just shows you value the other person's time and you understand that this might disrupt their plans.
Right, it's like acknowledging the impact on their schedule.
Exactly. And even a simple, I'm so sorry for any inconvenience this may cause, can go a long way.
Okay, so give notice, apologize, sincerely got it. Are there any other tips for making this process smoother? Because, sometimes finding a new time that works for everyone can be a whole other challenge.
Oh, absolutely. And the podcast actually has a whole section on negotiation and compromise. They talk about phrases like, let's play it by ear and no pressure but.
Oh, yeah. I've definitely heard those phrases before, but how do you actually use them effectively?
Well, play it by ear is great when you're not quite sure what your schedule looks like, yet, it acknowledges that things are flexible and you'll need to figure out the details later.
Right, it takes the pressure off having to commit to a specific time right away.
Exactly. And then no pressure but is a nice way to give the other person some space to consider their options without feeling rushed.
So it's all about creating a sense of openness and collaboration.
Right, exactly. You want to make the other person feel like you're working together to find a solution, not dictating terms to them.
I like that it's a much more respectful approach.
Definitely. And the podcast even gives an example of two people going back and forth trying to find a new meeting time. And it's really fascinating to hear how they use these phrases to navigate the conversation.
It sounds like it's almost like a mini negotiation in some cases.
Yeah, it can be. And that's why these communication skills are so important.
Okay. So we've got the key vocabulary, those handy phrases for bowing out gracefully, and the importance of clear communication and flexibility. What's the biggest takeaway here?
I think what resonated most with me is that mastering these rescheduling skills isn't just about language, it's about building stronger relationships.
Oh, that's such a good point. It's about showing respect for people's time and commitments.
Exactly, and that can go a long way in any relationship, whether it's with colleagues, clients, or even friends and family.
Absolutely well said. All right, so I think we've covered a lot of ground here today. Any other final thoughts before we wrap up? It really is amazing how something as simple as rescheduling can actually be like a little opportunity to build stronger relationships.
Yeah, it's funny thinking back on it. Like when I've been on the other side of a rescheduling request and it's handled well, I don't even mind.
That's so true. It's
Uh,
all about how it's done, right? Like,
Yeah.
what are some of the things that make that experience more positive for you?
Well, I think for me, it's like when someone is just upfront, like
Yeah.
they give me as much notice as they can and they genuinely apologize for the inconvenience.
It's like they're acknowledging that it impacts your day.
Exactly. But on the other hand, if it feels like someone is being dismissive or making excuses, then it can be a little bit of a turnoff.
Right. It's like they don't really value your time.
Yeah, and that can really damage the relationship.
So ultimately, it comes down to empathy, like putting yourself in the other person's shoes.
Exactly. And that brings us back to one of the main themes we've been talking about today. These rescheduling skills, these phrases, this whole approach, it's not just about speaking better English, it's about becoming a more thoughtful and effective communicator in any situation.
So well said. It's like those little things can make a huge difference.
Absolutely.
So what's the big takeaway for our listeners today? What do you hope they'll walk away with?
I'd say the biggest takeaway is this. The next time you need to reschedule an appointment, take a moment to think about not just what you're saying, but how you're saying it. Choose your words carefully, be sincere in your apology, and be flexible in finding a solution that works for everyone.
And hey, maybe have a backup plan or two just in case.
Exactly. A little preparation goes a long way. So remember those key phrases and strategies we talked about and approach those scheduling hiccups with confidence and grace.
Great advice. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the art of rescheduling.
My pleasure. It was fun.
We'll see you next time for another insightful exploration.